Hey everybody, it's Enoch again, here for yet another, Native American music lesson. And I love this stuff. I love getting ready for lessons. I love getting things together. Today is actually a really exciting day in terms of Native American music lessons because last lesson was lesson number 12, which means if we've done 2 lessons a month, and my math is correct, we have been going for 6 months, which means we should look at that kind of time frame, like what happened over the past 6 months. What did we learn? Where did we come from? Where are we now? Like, how much have we grown as students, as performers, as people who are learning things? Let's take a look back and see things. Now, normally this would be like a clip show, but I'm not going to show any clips from the past. We're just going to talk about what we've learned so far, and how we have progressed as performers and as players and people of expression in terms of using this great instrument. And I have a lot of flutes around me right now that I don't know which one I'm going to choose to play with. I'll go with this one because this is one of my favorites. So, starting off with lesson number 1, if we look all the way back to the very first lesson that we did, and it's all in YouTube, it's on playlists, which means you can go back and watch if you want to, and get more in depth on what we're going to do in this little quick overview. Lesson number 1, we talked about what to expect with lessons, like why do online lessons work and why don't they work? Why are you going to progress and not progress? What can you expect out of the lessons that we're going to have? And hopefully, over the course of the last 6 months, you've been able to see, wow, okay, here's what he's talking about. Here's how I can learn that kind of concept. And here's how I can implement that concept into my stuff at large, which I think is fantastic. So that's the hope, is that you were able to see what's going on in the world, see what's happening. And at some point, connect it to ourselves so that we understand how this is going to work for us. And that's important for everything, not just our online lessons, but how we're going to work in the world, how we're going to do school, how we're going to do whatever it is. We have to have an understanding for ourselves what to expect and how we can move forward and progress through that kind of world at large. And that was kind of one of the very first things that we talked about. Also, in that first lesson, we talked about the importance of breathing. Now, that sounds so silly when you think about it, right? We've been breathing our entire lives. Why all of a sudden should we be talking about breathing? Why has it become important? Well, is there really that much of a difference? And the truth is yes, right? How we hold the air inside of our bellies, inside of our lungs, inside of everything that's internal is different depending upon what we want to accomplish, right? As athletes, we may breathe slightly differently so we can get the energy and bursts of energy that we need for very short things. As musicians, especially wind musicians that are playing with the flute, we need to be able to inhale, have that breath last much longer than we're hoping it to last, and have it push forward as much as possible the expressions that we want to push, right? We have to be able to hold long tones. And that's the key here about the Native American wood flute. One of the big things that people love is the sound of the long tone. It doesn't matter all the fast stuff you play, that people get really happy with just this really deep sound. I mean, it sounds odd, but those are the notes that people really hang on to, are these long tones, right? Not the fast stuff. The fast stuff's great. But it's those long tones that people want. So breathing is so important to be able to allow us to have enough air so we can create these long tones and the expressions that we use in long tones and make it sound really cool. That's one of the big things that's important, is to make it sound really cool. And we talked about how breathing inside of this mechanism is a little bit different. We want to use our diaphragm, which is done right below our belly. That's where the diaphragm sits. And we want to use our diaphragm to actually pull the air into our lungs better. So we push down on that diaphragm, and that allows the lungs to fill up to a little bit greater capacity. And that's important. So we want to breathe. We're going to breathe in and push it down on our diaphragm and have it come in, and then we're going to slowly breathe out, right? So let's give us a count. 2, 3, 4. We're going to breathe in for like 4 beats if we can. 3, 4, 1, 2, ready, go. Now let's hold for 2 beats and breathe out. And that's good. That's all we want to do is we want to breathe in and breathe out and kind of have that pulse as we're feeling it to give us that kind of, okay, I now know where my lengths can be, right? Can I breathe out for 4 beats? Can I breathe out for 10 beats? Can I breathe out for 8 beats? Can I breathe out for 6 beats? Can I breathe out for 12 beats? How long can you breathe out for? The longest I've probably gone is like 24 beats, which is that's when you're really practicing and getting dedicated to it. As professional musicians out there, they can get really long, like 30 beats or even 32 beats. And there's a technique out there called circular breathing that allows you to breathe even longer while you're inhaling. It's about building up pressure in your cheeks so that you're still pushing air out while you're inhaling in. Great people who circular breathe, like Wynton Marsalis, who plays the trumpet, Kenny G, who plays the saxophone. These guys can go for long, long, long times without what it sounds like breathing. And it's because they're using this circular breathing technique to be able to get the breath out there. Wind instruments require breathing, and it requires you to focus in on the breathing. It requires you to actually get better at breathing properly. Plus, breathing is actually a really good thing to help you with relaxation, helps you with concentration, helps you with focus. Taking some time just to focus in on the breath, breathe in, breathe out, is a really good thing. Not only for just, your own, but especially when we're talking about the flute, because it's the long tones we got to practice. It's the long tones that makes everyone happy. It's the long tones that make people go, yes, I really want to hear more of that. So getting into the idea of breathing in, holding, and breathing out is really what we're trying to get to. And that's one of the importance of our very first lesson, was the idea of what are we going to expect about these lessons, but also why is the breath so important? Because the breath is vitally important. We move on to the second lesson. In our second lesson, we start talking about the understanding keys of the flute, right? Here is this instrument. If we want to learn how to play the instrument, we better understand the instrument, right? How it works. And it's not super complex by any means, right? This is not like a saxophone or a flute or a trombone or trumpet. It doesn't have all sorts of curves or bends or anything. For the most part, it looks like a tube. That's really what it is, right? But part of understanding how the flute is, or what the flute does, is understanding the key of the flute. What does this little letter on the back of the flute mean if you have it, right? I have this little letter E. So what does that mean on the back of the flute? If I pick up another flute and I see it here, I have on the bottom, I have the letter A. Okay, cool. What does that mean, right? Why do all these different flutes that we have different letters? This one's actually really difficult to see, but it's a letter G right there. I don't know if you can see it. It's black on black, so it make it really tricky. But it's a letter G. Why do the flutes have different letters? What do those mean? And what does that really? Does it matter for me as a musician? Well, the truth is yes and no, right? If you're just playing alone, solo performance, it doesn't really matter what necessarily the key of the flute is, because you're not really pairing up with anybody else. But if you are playing with other people, playing with an accompaniment, playing with something else, then it does matter what the key is, because that key is a signifier. Or that letter name is a signifier and designates what tonality that flute works in. The name of the flute, the letter of the flute, right here at the very bottom, that letter signifies the key of the flute, the minor key of the flute. So this is an E, which means this flute is going to be an E minor flute. Now, that what also means is the very lowest tone of the flute is the E. That's the E tone, okay? And we build up from there the different notes that we can get. With our scale, we're going to keep our finger here. So our very first scale at large, we're keeping our finger here, and we're just going to move our fingers up each note, right down, up and then back down. We're not going to do any type of fancy craziness. But that's the idea of this, is this here, right, is the anchor finger, and we're going to create some sort of scale. And what does that scale mean? Now, we talked in our second lesson, the idea of the notes of the flute. Because again, we have to understand the instrument if we really want to be able to play it as best as possible. So the notes of the flute. First, we have the name of the flute. Then we skip over the next letter in the alphabet, and we get to whatever this letter here is by skipping over. So here's E. Normally we go to F, but we're going to skip over F and we're going to get to G, right? So here's our G, and then we're going to go right up the alphabet to A. Now remember, in the musical alphabet, it goes from A to G and then goes right back to A. That's why from G we go right back to A. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And it's just a big circle over and over again. So we go back to our flute, right? So we start off with the name of the flute. That's E. We skip over a letter, skip over F, get to G, get to the next letter, A, go to the next letter, B, skip over whatever the next letter is. So we're going to skip over C, get to D, and then we go right back to the next letter, which is E. So we have E's here and here, and then we skip, G, A, B, skip, D, E. And that's how the names of the flutes work, the names of the notes on the flute. And that's pattern works for every flute. If I have my A flute, skip over whatever this letter is, B, get to C, D, E, skip over this next letter, so skip over F, get to G, and then we go back to A. And that's the names of the flute, of the letters on the A flute. Again, with any different types of flute, it's the same pattern. Name of the flute, skip over letter, skip over letter, or letter back to name if you really want to go back that far. And that's really the simplistic way of understanding the notes of the flute and the names of the notes of the flute. And we talked about that in our second lesson. Why is that important? Because as we're looking at the names, or as we're looking at the flute, we really do want to understand how these notes can work and how they actually work with other instruments, right? If I'm playing with a piano and I'm playing on my A flute, I know that the notes I can play are A, then C, D, E, and A, C, D, E, then G and A. I know that those are the notes I can play with, which means I can play with an A minor scale, a C major scale, and I kind of have an idea of what other notes I can play with. Can I play in the F major scale? Well, I don't really have an F in my note catalog yet, so not really as easily, even though I could potentially. Most of the notes are there, I don't ever have the F, so it makes it trickier for me to play in. So knowing the names of the notes that you can have at your disposal is very good and very easy. We focused very much on the lower hand in that first lesson because we really want you to understand these notes here and get these things to be able to play as best as possible, right? You want to be able to learn how to play these notes. And those notes are, one of the foundations of what we're playing, and how most of the music is heard is on the lower hand. And our lower hand is, able to have its positions: first position, second position, third position, fourth position. Those are the positions of the lower hand. And we talked about that in the second lesson. Now, on the third lesson, we jumped a little bit because we started talking about the idea of beats and the importance of metronomes. Here is my Boss metronome, right? My Dr. Beat. Again, my DB90. It's a lot more of a metronome than anyone needs. It's a little bit more expensive. I love this metronome. I think it's fantastic, but you don't need anything nearly this big or nearly this drastic. But metronomes are great because they give us this click that we can start to follow along with. And we can start creating our own internal beats to this click. I'm just putting the metronome at 60 beats per minute. So it's just a very simple click track, nothing super large. It's 1 beat per second. Click, 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 click. And those beats, that click, is a good thing for the internal pulse, because what we want to do is we want the internal pulse to be able to drive us and allow us to make expressions. When we don't play within rhythm, it's really difficult for the audience to follow. So having a rhythm, having an internal pulse is great because it allows the audience to go, I like what you're putting out there. I like what you're playing. I want to hear more of it. So let's keep it going. So we want to have that internal pulse. And that's really the kind of importance of like metronomes, beats, and this internal pulse. We also learned about note types. That's moving on to lesson 4. We took the metronome, we took the beats, we moved into the idea of note types. So we talked about whole notes and half notes and quarter notes and eighth notes. And what does that mean in terms of like the pulse and how does that work? Because adding these divisions and subdivisions into our notes makes it much more interesting as we're playing music, right? It makes it so that it's easy for people to understand where we are, what we're trying to convey, in the expressions that we're performing. Especially, once you understand note types, you can start going, oh, okay, I can see how a faster note type, like an eighth note or a 16th note, put into this context, makes something that's a little bit more interesting for the audience to hear. Right? It's not just playing quarter notes or whole notes. While that can be pretty and can be beautiful and can be actually very creative, maybe it's not as interesting as adding a little bit of flourish with an eighth note here or there. Right? Having those little bit more faster notes makes it a little more interesting, gives a little bit more character, and allows you to express a little bit more. And that's one of the real big powers behind understanding the beat, understanding note types, and how we can use that inside of our own world. We then moved on to lesson 5, where we took all these concepts of rhythm and the lower hand notes and started creating patterns that we could use, that we can practice, and actually have it be put into our music to create a little bit different sound or a little bit different song. So the patterns would be something like an ascending pattern. I follow that by a descending pattern. Very simple. Pattern going up, pattern going down. Maybe another pattern is the every other pattern, right? So you're just skipping every other note to create this ascending and descending pattern. Maybe you do it every third note pattern. So So all of a sudden it's every other note, right? So it's every third note. And creating patterns allows us as musicians to kind of have something that we can fall back on, utilizing the similar patterns over and over again. I talked a little bit about how like B.B. King, and one of my favorite guitar players, is very, powerful, is very moving, has some amazing stuff. But when you get right down to it, he's only using like 7 patterns, and those 7 patterns have just been known all over the different keys, all over a different fretboard, so he can use it whenever he wants to. But his music is actually pretty simple when you start breaking it down. Knowing patterns allows us to create more complex things because we can add the patterns together and put them in different tonalities, put them in different note structures, and all of a sudden it sounds just really cool. So having a pattern that you can start to work through, that you can call your own, is really good. And we talked about how it's important for us to create these patterns and create these expression moments that we can reuse again. The next lesson 6, started talking about the idea of the notes on the upper hand and how those notes now can actually allow us to move forward, create a full minor pentatonic scale. And since we already talked about that, right, the notes again are, we have the name of the flute, skip over a letter. Now we get to the note, skip over, note. So on my E, it's E, G, A, B, D, E. Now we have the upper notes. And because we add the upper notes, now we get the full pentatonic scale. And we get more interesting ideas. That moved us straight into lesson number 7, where we were able to say, let's extend our thoughts on the idea of creating patterns and create some patterns that utilize the entire flute instead of just utilizing the lower hand, right? Now we have the ascending and descending patterns using the full flute, which we have played beforehand. We can use the same skip idea, using that type of idea on the flute, creating a pattern there. Right? All of a sudden now we have a newer pattern that we can play around with. And creating these patterns allows us again to kind of put it into our musical tool bag, and whenever we want to, pull out the right tool for the right idea that we want to convey at that moment. And that's the power of creating expressions based upon what we have learned in the past. Then, after talking about creating expressions and actually using these patterns to our benefit and adding more patterns that you can have for your own, we start talking about like different types of techniques for expression using the flute. We talked about the idea of attacks and releases, and how an attack is a way that you start something, and a release is the way you end something, right? And we also talked about expression in terms of language, like how music is a language, and how that language can be conveyed over completely different ideas and different thoughts, but you have the power to express whatever you want to express. Language is an expression tool, and so you want to have your music be the language that people understand. You want to be able to express the ways that you want to express. Attacks start off the sentences or start off the phrasing, and releases end the phrasing. And those are important things to understand. How do we start the phrase versus how do we end the phrase? And what's all the stuff in between? And so we start talking about attacks and releases. And over the next two lessons, we actually talked about a lot of different attacks, a lot of different releases, right? So lesson 8 and 9 talked a lot about the idea of attacks, releases. We talked about the sigh attack, which is just you blowing into the flute. We talked about the who attack, which is you pushing a little more air in. So like you saying who. A little bit more pronounced, right? We talked about the do attack, which is you saying the word d. Do, 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 do. And it gives you a little more precise attack. We talked about the to attack, the idea that you can go ta, 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 and all of a sudden now you have a much more precise attack, right? Ta, ta, ta. So all those four range from a very light to a very more stronger or more precise version of how you attack. We talked about releases, how there's a similar type of idea with releases, how releases can trail off, which is just like the fade out attack or release. Sorry, fade out release. Just like you running out of air. We talked about how you can just be the cut off where you're blowing and you just cut the air off immediately. Again, a much more precise release, a precise end to it. We talked about the idea of putting your tongue up to the top of your teeth and cutting off the airway that way, where you're going, or sorry, before we do that, it's a tonguing one where our tongue stuck in the hole, and so we're stopping it with our tongue. So we're I'm talking about that type of a release. So it's a much more precise release because your tongue is stopping the air instead of you just stopping it with your breath, right? Then we talk about this thwip attack where you put your tongue up to the top of your teeth and you go this kind of this thwip sound. And how that causes a little bit different sound, and how these sounds can be create the idea of overblows, which is a different type of expression technique, and some of these other really interesting kind of sounds, and how using the way you attack and the way you end a phrase allows you to express things in a lot different way, right? So now we can say things with a little bit more precision, or say things with a little less precision, and express a different type of idea, right? Something sad may be very sigh and fade out heavy in terms of how you're playing it. Whereas something a little bit more jaunty or a little bit more lighthearted may actually be some of these more precise attacks, right? So all of a sudden now we have a lot of different ways to rethink the shape of our expressions, how we start something, how we say something, and the messages that we're trying to convey, right? And that's really where lessons 8 and 9 kind of went to. Lessons 10 started talking about, well, we've opened up the flute right now to the world of, hey, we're playing this whole, the full minor pentatonic. Is there another pentatonic we can do? And we talk about the idea of anchor fingers, and how we have an anchor finger that just sticks here, and now we're changing the anchor finger from our fourth finger here to our third finger, and how the different pentatonic scales made creating that new anchor finger. So we have the original pentatonic. And we have the new pentatonic. And how those two different sounds now, those two different types of tonalities, are really kind of cool by only moving one finger. And that's really like the power behind it. We've only changed one finger, and we're now able to express in a completely different set of, like, words. We have a little bit newer vocabulary to play around with than what we have been using in our past with just the one pentatonic. So now we have two different types of vocabularies we can play around. The lesson number 11 and number 12, we start talking about the expansion of one, emphasis, and then two, what emphasis does for us. In lesson 11, we talked about the idea of emphasis being neighbor notes and trills. And what a neighbor tone is it's the note that's right next to another note. So here's a neighbor note. It's the note that's right next to another note. For us, it's to the fingering that are really close to each other, right? That's the neighbor note, and how we can emphasize a note by stressing the neighbor note, right? Right, our first pitch becomes really important because of the way the neighbor note just kind of bends back into the first pitch. A trill is just shaking between those two notes really fast to emphasize whatever that note is. And the cool thing about trills is it allows us to say which note do we want to emphasize. The note after the trill is the one that's going to be the more pronounced. So if I want to emphasize ascending, I'm just going to stop my trill on the ascending side of it, the neighbor that's ascending, and then either move up or just kind of land on that ascended note. Right, all of a sudden that ended note sounds more distinct because we have that neighbor tone, that trill that leads into it. And on the flip side, you can actually do the same thing with your descending note, right? So whatever the descending note is, you just trill into the descend, and all of a sudden that note gets a little more emphasized. So the trill is kind of a cool little technique to allow us to showcase multiple notes, but also showcase an emphasis. And then we get to last week. And last week, we talked about the idea of, since we have these two tonalities, we have these two scales, as both pentatonic by the change of just one finger, really is what we're talking about. How do we emphasize, or how do we make it so that we can move between those two tonalities very distinctly? And we talked about the idea of emphasis using the trill, or emphasis using as this idea of the static note, just the repeated note over and over again, using that note as an ear changer so that we can get into the next tonality, right? So let's have this. And all that type of transitioning between the two tonalities is done just by that repeating process, right? Trilling allows us to emphasize a note, which means if we emphasize a note, we can transition or pivot. And this is a word that I used a lot inside of the last lesson, pivot into the new tonality, because we can now use that one note as an anchor. We also talked about the idea with alternate fingerings, how we can use these alternate fingerings to our advantage to pivot on alternate fingering notes so that we can get in and out of different tonalities. And that's the idea of where we stopped last week, was this idea of kind of transitioning between the two different tonalities. Now, that's a lot. We just covered a lot, and we didn't go into in-depth with anything. So if you want to learn more, I highly recommend going back to listen to some of the lessons so you can learn more, because there is some really cool in-depth stuff that we got into. But I wanted to show you where we came from, right? If you started with nothing and you just started with, hey, I just have an interest in learning how to play the flute, by the time you get to lesson 12, all of a sudden now we're talking about you moving back and forth between two different types of scales, and the flexibility and power that is in your expressions that can be created through that type of idea is really cool. I mean, starting from not knowing much of anything to this point where you're able to move back and forth between two different types of worlds for expression is really fun and really neat. And it's something that not a lot of musicians or players really have a good grasp or hand on. So if you're following along and you've been learning and watching this stuff and practicing and doing what you need to, and you're at this point now where you're flipping back and forth, congratulations, man. That's awesome. You are doing some amazing stuff. If you're still wanting to, get into this, look at what you can learn over a 6-month period just by putting a couple, efforts in once every 2 weeks. And that's really all we did, was just once every 2 weeks, kind of share a new concept, share a new insight, share a new idea, and get you to a point where you're able to start expressing yourself better than where you were able to beforehand. Music is such a cool thing because it is such a valuable tool to help us express things. It allows us to express things that maybe our words just aren't able to express. But if we don't know what we're doing, it sounds horrible as we're starting off. I get that. I totally get that. Here, what we're trying to do is give you a little bit of guidance so that it doesn't sound nearly as bad. It's not always the perfect thing. I don't always play perfect, and neither should everybody. I mean, even the most professionals in the world practice over and over again because we're trying to get better, we're trying to perform better, and we're trying to be better musicians. But the ability of you to start your journey of this expression using the flute is yours and yours alone. And I'm hoping within the last 6 months you've been able to see how this kind of journey is taking shape and where you can go with that. I am so excited with all the stuff that we've done in the lessons. We have covered a lot of material, and we're only at lesson 12. Well, today's lesson 13, but we're only we're in our small low stages. Imagine where we could be within like lesson 36 or lesson 50 or something like that. Imagine what that possibility could be. I don't want to think about that far down the road. I just want to get you to wherever the next point is, and let us hope that I'm giving you the right tools and the right guidance to be able to get there. And I think if you look at what we've done, you'll agree that we're on a good road. We're on a good path. So thank you so much for watching. I do have to give a real quick shout out and thanks to all my Patreon supporters and followers, because without them, I wouldn't be able to do any of this stuff. They do some amazing things to help me, keep me going and everything like that. I thank you for you, YouTube people, Facebook people, all the social media stuff that's going on, for watching the videos if you want, when you watch them, and hoping you're liking them the way you like them. Again, the idea here is to help you build up your skill set and help you become the best type of performance out there as you possibly can. I love doing these things. I'm so excited because in 2 weeks we're going to get back right on the horse and start talking a little bit more about some musical stuff and musicality and expressionism and professionalism, all the other things that goes alongside that. So I'm excited to get back into that, but I want to take a quick moment just right now to kind of take a snapshot of where we are, where we have come from, and where we currently are right now, so we can showcase where we're going to be, because that's where it gets super exciting. So thank you so much again to everybody. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.